All right, shall we get started? Welcome everybody. We are here to talk about RPC, JSON-RPC standardization. There's a channel on the Discord, R&D Discord, on just this subject. You'll see a lot of recent conversation on the matter. The TLDR, I think, is that the world of RPC for interacting with an Ethereum client is far larger than our execution specs would imply. So that means that there are a number of methods that are out there that people are using, that they're finding useful, that are underspecified, not specified at all, etc. The space hasn't really been updated in quite some time. So I think one of the things that Felix is kind of driving here, and I'll turn it over to you if you like, Felix. There's maybe time for a little bit of refactor, redesign, and expansion of how we work with our RPCs, how we get different stakeholders involved, etc. So is that an acceptable intro, Felix?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, for me, it's mostly just about the specifics. So, I mean, I've written this document, and I mean, there's a long kind of view there, but there's also these short-term items that we can very specifically improve the situation in our limited circle. And I think these would be kind of preferable for me, just like figuring out the details of certain RPCs and, for example, with the tests and the specification, because yeah, for me, it's just very frustrating. I've been authoring a specification, I mean, helping with that. And I also maintain the tests. And it's just kind of annoying when these tests basically never work. I mean, they work for Geth, but that's because Geth kind of generates them, right? So that makes it easy for us. And we use them as regression tests as well. But then it's kind of like for the other clients, there's always some issue that prevents them from really being like, I mean, some of them work, but they are like, depending on the client, various issues with it. And I really want that thing to, like be working, because only then we can start actually making some solid decisions. So yeah, that's basically what motivated me to start this conversation. But obviously, yeah, the long points are also quite important.
Okay, so maybe we should talk about the RPC compat tests themselves, because that's a really good point. That seems like table stakes, right? So let's all get on the same page, get those tests passing, and care about them before we start proceeding with additions, subtractions, refactorings, etc.
Sorry, was that a question?
No, I was actually opening it up to the room. How do people feel about RPC compat as a subset of the Hive tests? Are your clients passing them? Do you find utility in it? Is it worth going back and making sure they all pass to kind of establish a baseline of RPC usage before we move forward? I mean, from Besu's perspective, yes, we think that there's value there. We're not currently passing them. I think we're breaking so early that we can't even tell how much of them we're passing. We suspect that we're passing a lot more than we can actually tell at the moment.
Oh, this is
And
yeah, but this is specifically, I think, because of the Prague fork. So because
yeah,
in for this fork cycle, I actually made the somewhat controversial decision to just include the Prague stuff in the RPC test a bit earlier than last time. So for the last fork, we only really included it there after the fork was already like fully defined. But for this cycle, we've been sort of more proactively updating these tests. But it means that, like, since, for example, on Hive 2, the clients just run from their default development branch. If some stuff isn't there on that branch, then basically we'll fail to load the chain. So this is kind of an expected thing.
and I'm fine with that. I think from Besu's perspective, I think that's kind of a good thing, frankly. I'd be curious to hear how other teams feel about that concept.
Hello, it's from Nethermind. Yeah, we are willing to fix these tests, and we are constantly experiencing issues, compatibility ones, because mostly our client is accessed using Go libraries, which well, mostly adapted for usage with gas, and it breaks a lot. So we are trying to fix this. As for these tests, in addition to fixing them, I would actually add more to cover more transaction types, probably. This is the hottest topic right now, which we are trying to fix. Because, well, for example, specification contains such field like transaction type, text type, or type. I'm not sure about the specific name, and it's marked as required, and other fields are marked as required in JSON-RPC spec, I guess. But actually, they are not required, and gas even does not use text type. So I would discuss maybe in Discord or a separate call this part of the API, and for sure we would like to fix these tests. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So, I mean, I kind of know what you mean, but basically, I guess you are talking about the get transaction by hash, or
Estimate call, estimate gas.
oh, I
Call.
see.
Yeah.
Estimate gas and call. Yeah. So they do not have the transaction type. That's correct. Yeah. So I am actually I have it open for Nethermind right now, and then for example, so for Nethermind, on these tests, I see so Nethermind is able to successfully import the chain, and the failures in the test are mostly related to some error conditions. So this is one thing. Like for the error conditions, we do not always agree on the error code or on the like existence of the error in the first place. And then there are also some differences in the default parameters for each call. So basically for Nethermind, there is the thing that one of the environment options for the call, like the gas prices or whatever it is, it differs from gas. We have to figure out, like if we want to standardize on that or not. But either way, this is what I can see. And yeah, for estimate gas, it's kind of the same. I mean, it works, but it's not. It doesn't come up with the same result. Notably, we have something new in the spec that still has to be implemented in the test, where like some of the tests are marked to be spec only. So basically, they should not fail because they are just only there to check that the result matches what the spec says it should look like. For example, for estimate gas, it's not required to use the same algorithm on all clients. So you can consider these to be passing right now, and we just have to update the testing to ensure that this error will not happen. So basically, it will not be marked as failed. This is something which I am doing. But then mostly what I'm seeing is that, for example, the Nethermind returns the chain ID for legacy transactions. So that appears to be a difference. And there's also, oh wait, so it does not return the chain ID. So that's the thing. It does not return the chain ID for legacy transactions, even though it probably should. And it also does not return the V, this V field for the signature values. This is because, yeah, the V thing is kind of, I mentioned that in the document as well. There are some, basically it's a legacy field, but we decided that because there are so many client libraries that still use it, we kind of just want to make it part of the spec anyway. It's kind of the interchangeable name of this Y parity. And yeah, so we thought that maybe could be something like if, for example, Nethermind were to add the V field, then they would be passing like a lot more tests. So that's something to consider anyway. If it would be pretty easy to.
So do we have enough flexibility in our schemas to allow for both the example that you just cited with the V becoming Y parity? as well as some of like the gas estimation stuff you were talking about there. You're talking about tests that you don't necessarily care about the results, but you do care about spec compliance with them, right? Because they are necessarily, non-protocol, and they could have different implementations, different algorithms, right? So I guess my question is this a good segue to talking about how we specify those return values with some flexibility that allows for both ignoring values in cases of gas estimation, but also maybe synonyms or aliases for fields, things that would allow us to do backwards compatible specs.
I don't know. I mean, I would say that, for example, for get transaction by hash, we want the output to agree in all of the clients, and it's not just about this. It shouldn't just be that the client returns something according to the spec. That is guaranteed anyway, because we basically check all of the test vectors against the spec already. So basically, we know that the output that's in the test has been validated by the spec. That's a precondition for committing the tests into the spec. So that part is kind of done. It's more just for something such as estimate gas, the result is a single number, but how we can come up with this number is like up to the implementation. But for transactions, I think they should just look the same. And then when we say, for example, with the signature value V, it's just, in the old days it was called V, and now it's called Y parity. They just kind of changed it. And I mean, yeah, obviously we can try to force that change, but for this specific case, since it was kind of it's just like very hard to estimate who has updated the library and so on. So we think it's just easier to return V and be done with it. That's kind of how we see it in that particular case. So we feel like basically every client should just add this field and then it's fine. And then there are some other cases like that as well, where basically get doesn't return a field that's returned by some other client. For example, there is the thing with returning the author. So in Nethermind, it returns this field author for the block, and Geth doesn't return it. So I mean, yeah, technically we could just add author there, and then I guess Nethermind would also pass that test. So we just have to make a decision, like, do we want that? Do we just want to codify all of these current differences into the spec and sort of make them final, so we have a stable baseline? Or do we want to actually fully resolve each of these backwards compatibility concerns? And
let me kind of rephrase my question. Do we like that we're testing both spec compliance and functionality at the same time with the same tests? I'm of the mind that we do, but I'd be open to arguments to the contrary. And it sounds like there aren't any.
yeah, I don't really know.
Okay.
I mean, we don't really have much choice. We used to have this other test suite, the RPC test suite, that was specifically for testing like I would say, let's say it was supposed to be this more relaxed test suite where it wouldn't really check what the individual responses were. It was just kind of checking that the normal sort of like flow of using an RPC library would kind of work. Like that was the purpose. But these tests, because they require the click block production, we will basically disable them. So they still exist, but I mean, since that stuff is all kind of deprecated now, we basically think that this test suite is a bit over, and we would rather focus on the RPC compat tests and make them a bit better.
Interesting. Okay, so that's an interesting bit of history I did not know. So we tried to do a pure spec only test and then failed to maintain it sufficiently, is what it sounds like.
No, it's not that. It's more like just that we had this idea that basically there should be these two types of tests. So one is checking the outputs of the client against some known output, and this is what RPC compat does. And I think that is very valuable if we can agree on this output. But the agreeing is the hard part, I think. And the other thing is, we could also have these sort of like integration tests in a way where basically we just use a library such as ethers.js and we try to access the API and see if it works, like that kind of thing. And we can make this work. So that's something that can be done. And we have done this for the Go ETH client, which was also mentioned by Nethermind. So definitely, this is what this old RPC test suite was all about. It was basically just using the Go ETH client and check if it works against like the other nodes, like not just Geth. And it mostly worked. But this test suite with the ETH client is kind of on its way out, I would say, because the way this test is set up doesn't really work anymore. And we would have to make some extensive changes to update it to the current world where we have the beacon chain and so on. And this hasn't really happened yet. So basically, we would have to launch like an entire little like DevNet within this test suite to make it work. And that's kind of just like beyond the scope of the time that we have right now for working on this. So we would rather just drop this test. And it was always a bit brittle anyways. But yeah, I mean, these kinds of integration tests would be very valuable also, because then we could at least see that, for example, for a specific version, like the latest one of Ethers.js, it actually works with the nodes. That's a pretty important property. But I feel like ultimately, if we can agree on the known output of the API, it's much better, because it just means we know exactly what they will return. So it's a much stronger guarantee than just having this weak sort of like it works type of thing.
Okay, thank you.
These RPC compat tests, are these, do they match the spec in the execution spec repo? I'm not sure if that's the right
Yeah.
repo. Okay.
Yeah. So basically, I can maybe also explain a little bit how these tests are created. So the way this works is the tests themselves, they are contained within the execution specs, execution APIs repository. So you can see them here. I will post a link as well. So basically, this is where the tests live. And the Hive runner tool, it just pulls these tests and executes them against the node which it launches. And in order to run these tests, the client has to import the test chain, which is contained in the same directory. So there's this genesis.json file and then the chain.rlp file. And the Hive tool kind of removes the hard part of basically configuring the client with this Genesis file and the appropriate forks and so on, because that process differs between the different execution layer clients. So basically, that's why we use Hive for this, because it means we know that we can initialize all of the clients. And then basically, we just perform these interactions, and then we check that the result is correct. But then for some of the tests, for example, for estimate gas, we actually have a little note on there on the test that says the test is spec only. I will post a link to that as well just now. So here you go. And then for the spec only things, like if it has this magic comment in there, then basically we know that this test is not supposed to be matched directly against the client output, but it should just be validated according to the specification. Although, like I said, this part is not implemented in the test runner. So this is kind of a recent addition with this spec only thing. Like we didn't used to have it, but it's kind of added.
And I don't think we're imagining a lot of instances of these, right?
No. This is mostly just for things like estimate gas and possibly for call. So the thing about call, but I mean, it's also kind of boring because honestly, with call, obviously the result is going to be a hex string, but the content of that hex string is very important. So I would hope that we can come up with some test cases where we actually see what the output is. And I've tried to highlight this a little bit, like actually, so this is where the tests are stored, but the tests are actually kind of generated by another tool, which at the moment it lives in this repository here. I mean, this is also all kind of documented. So basically here we have this tool, and these tests and the test cases, they are created against a test chain, and this is generated by this tool called Hive chain. And Hive chain, it generates basically a chain that contains a bunch of interesting contracts as well. where that can be called or that will basically be executed as part of the chain progression. And what this means is this test chain will actually contain, for example, multiple transactions of varying types, and it contains logs and stuff like that. So we can test all kinds of functionality. So that's kind of why we have this test chain. So we basically have some known outputs to compare to. We could technically also use like a test net, but the advantage with something like Hive chain is that the test chain can be very short. Like it's only 20 blocks, but it contains basically everything we need. So that's the thing. We don't really want to wait like 10 minutes for the client to import this chain to then be able to make the queries. So that's why we have a synthetic chain there. But yeah, I mean, maybe it would be easier if we used like a test net because we know the clients can import it, but at the same time, the test nets usually don't have so much interesting activity in a very short range. So yeah, that's why. Anyway, this is kind of how the tests come to pass. So technically, you guys could all just like import these tests in your unit tests, like you do with, for example, the execution spec tests. And this would give you a much tighter feedback loop than waiting for Hive or checking Hive or whatever. But in practice, it's not really required either. So, like, I mean, we also don't do it in Geth. Basically, I just occasionally check Hive and see like how we stand. And there's currently one issue for Geth but it's a test issue. So yeah, that's kind of that.
Yeah, okay, cool. I think because you said like these tests are based on the specification, that this means that if other clients do not pass these tests, there likely is a divergence in the the spec, and yeah, they simply do not match the spec. So I think it was already mentioned on Discord or somewhere else. Like it would be really great if you indeed can get all the clients to pass the current tests. So that means that we indeed have a base, a base that we can agree as that to expand like the specification. And also for like this thing like estimate guess, I think that would also be currently the only example I would know where there might be a difference in the output of these clients, and that would only, maybe not only be on the, because the output of estimate guess, that's only the guess proposed, right? Like, okay, you should use this guess, and then it will go through.
But like how the clients come up with this guess, like especially for estimate guess, it's really not something that we can specify because
I agree.
So that's that. But for call, for example, it's quite interesting. Like the calls, so we have this, like if you see it, like basically Reth and Nethermind both have this thing where they return like a different output for this one test, which I will link now for Reth here. So here it is. And this one is kind of interesting because it makes a call with no input, and then it just kind of sees how it is configured. And if you click the link there, that's also in the test, but I can also show it. You can also see the contract that it is calling, and in this contract we just return, for example, the different parameters that are part of the EVM chain environment. For example, we return the block number, the chain ID, base key, and so on. And then so we can see that, for example, for Reth and Nethermind, since they can currently execute this test, we see that it has a difference with Geth, I guess, in the base fee or something. Like basically there's a 0 there, where in Geth there's no 0 or something. So this is a difference where I would say it would be interesting if we can agree on this, because obviously people would want to rely on these properties in their client libraries. At the moment, it's really not safe to rely on these defaults, even though the fields are optional in ETH call. If you don't specify them, you're gonna have a hard time, because it means you will basically get like an arbitrary result.
Yeah, because like ETH calls should definitely be deterministic, but I see that it's being called with latest, and that might be the problem, that it might be called on like a different block.
No, that's not the case, because in this test, the chain is known and it does not move. So basically we expect that like when the test is launched, the client is exactly located at block 20 of this test chain. And it's the same, it's a known chain. So this is not the difference. The difference is one in the client configuration somehow. Like it somehow uses a different setup, basically, for this call.
Right. Okay. Yeah, but this should definitely be yeah, the client should agree, because this should really be deterministic. So this is, well, I would say somewhat alarming, actually.
Yeah, and then the other case that I'm trying to highlight that's actually kind of interesting is, for example, this is something that came up very recently, and I've even tried to bring it up in ACD. So there is this situation where one area that users have very often asked us about is this thing when you perform the ETH call and the execution will revert. And then in that case, it's the interesting question, what will happen? Like what will be the response? And in ETH call, like typically the idea is that if the call fails, it will return an error, like a JSON-RPC error. But then what is contained in that error can be quite important. For example, a lot of people want to see the actual raw revert data so that they can parse it on the client side. And yeah, this is something where basically we don't all agree like how to actually do this. So for example, if I post this test here, you can kind of see it as well. So for Nethermind here, for example, Nethermind returns, you can see it with like the lines which have the minus in front of them. They are what Nethermind returns, and the ones that have a plus are what the test expects. And notably, the test does not compare the error message. So the error message is excluded because we will never agree on the message, but it does compare the error code and the error data field. And you can see that interestingly, so for example, Nethermind, it returns in a different error code than Geth in this case. And it also returns these sort of like decoded ABI error. So it has already determined that this error is a solidity error of type user error, and it does not actually give access to the raw bytes. And yeah, the same is true of the next test. So this is something which is, I think these types of differences are very hard to resolve, because we would have to like agree on the error code and the data and so on. And we haven't really been able to do so successfully. Like even though I tried to bring it up in ACD and so on, we never really fully managed to, yeah, like get to a result where we're like, yeah, this is how we're going to do this.
Yeah. Yeah, I see. Just a small note. I also think that like the importance of this is like underestimated, because these RPC calls are not part of our consensus. So if you implement something differently, like the chain is not going to fork or to halt or whatever. So I think, yeah, this is felt to be like less important. But yeah, I mean, as you say it here, I think it is actually rather important, because it would not make sense, or it would actually be pretty dangerous if like one client reports this on the RPC call and another client reports something else. So I think it is indeed very important to standardize this and to really make work of this.
Yeah,
yeah.
I would agree with that. In fact, I would propose, I'm starting to collect agenda items for subsequent meetings. Error handling is likely an entire discussion point. Would you guys agree? We should spend some time in future meetings defining it and incorporating and designing ways to formalize it, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I agree. And I think like a very good starting point will to be, okay, let's really get all these clients on, let's get them running these RPC compat tests, and then indeed find those differences. Because like also on things like we have like this very simple chain, and yeah, just thinking about it, I think just a simple chain and then running on some calls on it, I think that indeed should cover most of it. But maybe there are also like some very weird edge cases with like parameters. For instance, like also like the pending parameter, for instance, for an RPC call is also something which I think clients will disagree on. So yeah, that would be a very good starting point to see where do clients diverge, and to use also that to really start standardizing these RPC specification. Yeah.
Cool. Does anybody have anything else so I would like to reserve some time, and we don't have to get to this right now, but I would like to talk about where we see this meeting going and when to start including external stakeholders. I think that was a subject that came up a bit in the R&D, where we think about, the customers for these RPCs, RPC providers, right? Wallet devs, dApps, L2s, all of those. So I would like to earmark maybe the last 10 minutes, if possible, of this meeting to discuss when we want to get them involved. But does anybody have anything else they want to cover before that?
Yeah, I would like to add that I think this meeting would be good for also discussing future changes and new features. I mean, we have on the spec repo a bunch of issues that regard to changes, not just like for consistency purposes, but also for users, like new features. They are different in scope. Some are about adding a new field. Some are about adding new methods. I think this group would be well suited to discuss things like this. Just wanted to bring it up since it was not mentioned a lot since the beginning of the call.
Yeah, I definitely think this is good. That's going to happen. I think once we set the table and have our kind of processes and things in place, this would definitely be the place for that. I think along those lines, one of the things that we talked about is like, well, okay, well, what's the process? Who gets to decide on the extensions? How are we going to take these things back to all core devs, et cetera? And I think that's kind of why we wanted to have the first meeting just core devs and not really extending it to those people who are going to care about the features, right? So I guess I'm yes-anding and just saying I think we need a little bit of time to get our feet under us before we start pulling in new features. But I fully expect that this would happen here. Anybody disagree with that? All right, anyone else?
I mean, we could talk a bit about the spec itself. I mean, that's kind of the other thing. So we have the specification right now. Like I mentioned in my document, it's basically defined as like this group of YAML files. And I think the spec itself is okay right now for what it is, but actually accessing the specification is very hard. Like if you really wanted to access it, like as a user or something, you'd have a hard time because it's not very readable. So it's more like a data file, I would say. And I mean, it's good to have a specification at all, but I think specification has to be readable at least a little bit. And it also, the thing is that technically the spec is complete, but in practice it uses the JSON schema to define the outputs. And what I found is that JSON schema is kind of okay for writing down how it should be, but when it comes to actually seeing like a validation error, it's really hard to use because the errors that it outputs are horrifying, basically. So if you, for example, if you forget, like the worst case is actually if you try to, we've hit this a couple of times when making tests, like when you specify a transaction result from get transaction by hash, for example, but you forget a field or you have it a wrong one, it will output, I don't know, like 100 lines of error, and you won't really get like what you did wrong, for example. So I think the tooling in the spec is super bad right now. And this is mostly because, well, it's using the OpenRPC tooling, which, I mean, it works, but it's not great. So this would be another big item. It's just like, how do we actually figure out something that works for us? So at the moment, like I also said, there is this viewer app.
One
So I
second.
don't know.
One second, Felix. So what you're describing is a gap in, is it specific to error reporting cases that we have bad tooling for? Do you see other areas where this is happening? And go ahead.
Well, I mostly just mean the spec. It's just not in the greatest shape. That's what I mean. I mean, obviously, it's kind of okay, but there just isn't really anything better right now for
Yeah.
like that's
Yeah.
the thing. So yeah.
And I appreciate what you're saying. Like, there's a lack of narrative. There's a lack of like written documentation and explanation. Like, here's why you would use this method. Here's an example, et cetera, et cetera. It almost seems that the specs right now are almost too machine generated.
Yeah, I mean it is handwritten, but it is kind of the thing that the spec is not the documentation. And we have this viewer app where you can technically access it. And I mean, you guys have probably seen it. I mean, it's here. So, but you can, if you actually drill down and you try to use this just to see, then you'll quickly find that as a developer, for example, this can be very frustrating because this app is just, yeah, well, it's just not very good. That's the thing. Basically, it's just a tool that allows you to see the schema. But the way this is executed is questionable, I would say. Like you have to click, basically, you have to click all the time to figure out the information. And then the actual information is, I mean, there's a lot there, but it's just also very dense. Basically, it will tell you for any field, ultimately, what is the regular expression that should match this field. And that's nice, but it's not really the most important information for someone. Like if someone wanted to figure out, for example, like what does this field mean, probably they don't want to know what's the regular expression. They want to know like what's the purpose of it, or when is this returned, or what could be a value here, or like why would I need this? And none of that is present. It's just very technical. We do have some examples, and we do also have this interactive inspector thing that allows you to make queries against an endpoint. So that's all very nice, but it's just like improving this thing would be awesome. Like if someone could figure out how to improve this app or make a new one or whatever, like that would be great. Like this app is, yeah.
This feels like solved problems somewhere, right? Like anybody using Open JSON-RPC, or what is it called? OpenRPC, would have this need. And
well, I mean, what you have to understand is that OpenRPC has kind of come together because of this API. It's maybe something you might not know, but like, I mean, Ethereum Classic created OpenRPC to define this API. So it's literally, this is what it was built for.
Yeah, good point. Yeah. Well, thank you for leading that elephant into the room.
Yeah, I know it's not so great. I mean, there's no easy answers. That's kind of why I propose this. It's kind of it's just, I mean, we cannot make like a lot of progress very quickly. I just mean it would be cool if we made some progress at least. So it can kind of start with like making some more test pass, figuring out like what tests to add, stuff like that. I mean, as far as I understand, the RPC compatibility will always be like a work in progress. We will basically never really reach a state where everything is perfect, and that's fine. But I do think we should like improve it a little bit. So that's kind of where because even if we make updates today, when it comes to external stakeholders, they will have to either replicate these or figure out if it makes sense. And there's also too many people to really agree on all the changes. That's the other thing. Like there will always be some level of backwards compatibility left in this API.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like an argument for deferring external stakeholder involvement for a little bit further.
Yeah, well, I mean, at least until we've kind of figured out like what we want to, where we want to go with this.
Yeah, good enough. Okay, well then I don't need that last 10 minutes. It sounds like that's a bigger question than we should open up today. So, you have anything else you'd like to cover, Felix, or anybody else?
Well, I would have a question maybe. So I'm a bit curious about things such as ETH send transaction. So it may be an interesting thing, but ETH send transaction is easily the most interesting method. We do not have tests for it. And the reason why that is because send transaction itself would require, like, in order for it to work, it requires the node to sign a transaction. And I mean, we have support for it in Geth, but we have always wanted to remove that. However, we have not done so because we know it's also a heavily used method in some use cases, and notably the wallets also implement it. So ETH send transaction may still be one of the major entry points into a wallet. So then the question is kind of like, which nodes actually do support it? I guess Bisu and Nethermind support ETH send transaction in some way, but I would be curious about your experiences with that, or if you are also planning to remove it at some point, or...
Oh no, we don't want to remove it. No. In fact, you know, that's one of the, again, L2 is really going to care about that one, right? Like we're actually building more methods that are like send transaction. Like we're building bundle methods that work on bundles of transactions. Now those are all pre-signed, but yeah, we're not, that's not going anywhere from our perspective.
Okay. So this, yeah, with the pre-sign is something else. That's
Yeah.
something that could be added. But the value,
Yeah.
one of the values in each send transaction was also that it kind of comes up with these values for you. So for example, if you don't specify the nonce in a transaction, then it will be assigned by the node. That's kind of the original purpose of each send transaction anyways. And I was more curious about this kind of stuff.
That's a good question. I should probably take that back to the team, frankly, because you're pointing at the past where the node was also kind of the wallet, right? Where like people were really setting up their nodes because they were going to use them to generate keys and sign transactions and all that kind of stuff. So yeah,
I don't want to remove that part. That's the thing. And
yeah.
it's not really clear. So, I mean, there was this idea with the profiles in my document where I was saying that like some things make more sense in one context and less in another context. For example, if
Yeah.
you're a wallet, then you have to implement this. But if you're the node, then you don't have to implement this. But then it's kind of the question, like, which other bits of functionality are sort of this like wallet space? And at the moment in Geth, it's a bit weird. Like we never really know like what we should support and what not. So we don't really support much beyond. I mean, we have estimate gas obviously, but then there's also things like ETH create access list. Then we and fill transaction is another good example. I'm not actually sure. Did we ever merge that to the spec?
Failed transaction?
Fill transaction, yeah.
I don't think so.
No.
No. So this was kind of, maybe I can highlight this. So so ETH fill transaction was like our attempt at sort of replacing. I mean, Geth supports this method and has for a long time. And so the idea with ETH fill transaction is that it would basically give you the default setting ability of ETH send transaction without actually sending the transaction. So basically, it would be a way for you to leverage the node's state knowledge to fill out a transaction that you want to send, but you wouldn't actually have to then send it. So basically, if you don't know the nonce of an account and you don't know the base fee and things like that, you could basically do ETH fill transaction and just say, I want to send 2 ETH from this address to this address. And then the node will return you all of the parameters that you would have to set in order to make this transaction.
And then you could send it to send raw transaction if you wanted to.
Yeah, well, you have to sign it first, but that's on
Sure.
you then. So that was our idea. Basically, this is one part of like our attempt to figure out this whole future beyond ETH send transaction. It is kind of a useful feature, but I have no idea. I mean, I think there's an open pull request to add it to the specification as well, but we haven't. I mean, Sina says we haven't added it, so I trust them. Anyway, it's one of these things that basically we think is very important because this stuff. Oh yeah, fill transaction is not there. So it's mostly because, well, like I said, so ETH send transaction is a very important one. And we do think that like some of it is super useful, but then like other things are less useful, like for example the signing and so on. So yeah.
Okay, there's maybe one point which I want to bring up. What we might want to actually do is to want to keep the base JSON specification like as low as possible. So, for instance, like I'm thinking about this field transaction thing. Like this should technically not be necessary because you can also query things like, okay, if get balance, if get transaction count to figure out the values which you should use. And yeah, I think my main point is that we should likely keep this specification as simple as possible. And then that's like well, let's say the end users, like the wallets, just query the methods which they want to use, and then use that to do whatever they want instead of filling these things in like this field transaction idea. Yeah.
Okay. FLCL, I have no idea what's your name, but you also have your hand raised.
Yeah, you can call me FLCL. I just wanted to mention that this method seems very useful to generate blob hashes and stuff. Probably we would try to add such one in Ethermite at some point. I mean, field transactions. But I raised the hand because I wanted to mention that it would be cool to iterate through through transaction from its specification, which fields are required formally for different types of transactions. Because if we do not post, for example, access list for blob or 1559 transaction, it will be okay. But this field is marked as required in some specification internals, as far as I remember. Additionally, this TX type field should be excluded or agreed to be like respected by all the implementations like that, because this is the most complicated object, and it seems like it's not specified fully, at least for me.
So can I quickly ask, are you talking about ETH send transaction when you say with the type? Or is it more about?
Calls estimate guess methods receive this object too, right? And
Okay, so it's about estimate gas and it's about that's actually a good point. So okay, so estimate gas and send transaction, they seem to require the TX type. I mean, that shouldn't be the case. Yeah. I get it. I mean, this is something we can look into, yeah, in the spec. That's good.
yeah, we have like a common object, right, for transaction for every method. Is it the same for estimate guess and send transaction? Maybe the same.
I'm checking it right now. I think it's the same. So we have in fee market, we have no. Wait. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So estimate gas and ETH call actually have the same. So this is maybe also something that is hard to. It's not really maybe. I mean, it is captured a little bit by the spec, but it's probably the same in all the implementations. So the input object for ETH call and ETH estimate gas is the same one. So that's that. And also for send transaction. So it's basically this like transaction input object, I would maybe call it, but it's not called that in the spec. In the spec, it's called a generic transaction. And as far as I can see, the type is not a required field there. So it has the generic transaction does not have any required fields in the spec.
Okay, I will find the place where I saw that. Maybe it's not visible on UI, on that UI you provided recently, but
no, it's more like
YAML.
I'm checking the source. So yeah, I was checking this thing. I posted the link here. So it doesn't mark these things as required.
No, you mean generic one.
Yeah. Generic transaction, yes. And as far as I understand, that is where, yeah, this is the input object. So in the spec, it's not required.
So it,
Or maybe it just requires all the fields by default. I have to check this. So I mean, this is something I will verify this. Maybe there's a problem with the. Maybe there's
yep.
a.
For other transaction types, for specific transaction types, there are lists of required fields, but not for this one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. But that's kind of what I mean. So the transaction schema is kind of split. So we have transaction inputs, which are for ETH call, ETH estimate gas, and ETH send transaction. But send transaction, I'm not sure if that. I think that's in the spec, but yeah. So basically, this input object is a generic transaction. And then we have the transaction outputs as well. And there we have the spec is a lot more complicated. So the spec uses a different object for each transaction type with different fields. And this has actually been a source of confusion in the past because at least in our implementation, we don't handle it this way. We only have one transaction object and that generates the output for all of the types. And in the spec is different. So there will sometimes be these differences in the test because of this. But yeah, in the output objects for transaction types, certain fields are required. That's true. But I think that's fine also because these fields are actually returned by the node as well.
And what should be defaults for these fields when we do not pass access list or gas price or anything like value in generic transaction?
Yeah, so what should be the defaults? So that is kind of a good question. That's what I meant earlier. So should we maybe agree on that? So that's the thing. At the moment, we in Geth, it's kind of a complex area. So for example, we will basically try to guess the transaction type based on the presence of certain things. So for example, if you send a transaction, like a value transfer, and then you will include an access list, it will create an access list transaction for you. But if you include the 1559 parameters, it will become a 1559 transaction and so on. If you put blobs, it will become blob transaction. So it's kind of like this, it's something that the node then has to do some guesswork to figure this out.
Yeah, we're now doing the same.
Yeah.
Depending on your presence.
So this is kind of what I meant. It's super complicated because in the end, this logic isn't really tested anywhere. There are no compatibility tests for send transaction because it requires accounts in the node. But at the same time, it's one of the most complex areas of the spec. So this is kind of an annoying situation. Like if we had fill transaction in the spec, we could add tests for all of these cases, but we cannot really do it right now.
So that's an excellent segue. We got 4 minutes left. I want to propose something maybe stupid, maybe kind of awesome. If send transaction needs a little bit of work and fill transaction could potentially provide new mechanisms for us to work with it with less, cruft, would that be a good first candidate for us to kind of do a vertical spike on refactoring that, getting together next meeting and saying, all right, what does it take to bring fill transaction into the execution spec and deprecate send transaction as kind of an experiment for us to figure out our process to refactor and improve upon the execution spec?
Yeah, well, it works for me, but we already have it, so.
I'm not really talking about implementation details, right? Like that's kind of not the interesting bit for us to be testing out here. Like I'm actually very interested in how do we document this? How do we deprecate it? How do we communicate it out? How do we specify it in the spec? All that kind of stuff. When I say vertical slice, I'm saying a part of the process that touches on all the different layers of getting the work done so that we can look at it and say, great, next time we need to do this, here's a loose process for doing that. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I guess it would be kind of similar to how we did it before. So basically, we have to figure out the specification of it. That's already where the problem's gonna start. I mean, we would have to, yeah. I mean, definitely, I want this for sure. Like, I'm totally on board. Let's try it.
Awesome.
But yeah, it's difficult.
Okay, so I'll take that as an action item for our next meeting. I'll post these notes somewhere. Maybe I'll talk to Pooja about the best place to post that. Yeah, and then we can continue the discussion async on how to work through it.
I would also propose to set up like a next meeting also.
Sure. Is this a popular time window for folks and just want to reuse this moving forward in a recurring fashion? Or, I mean, we've got pretty good attendance.
It works for me.
What's that?
Yeah, this works for me.
Okay, good.
It's good.
Great. Well, that's not broke, so we won't fix it. I will get it on the calendar. And that is our time. Thanks, everybody. It's great to see so many people interested in RPC stuff. How does 2 weeks sound? 2 weeks, 1 week for the next one?
I guess 2.
Yeah, 2 weeks is fine.
Awesome. Awesome. Great. See you on Discord and in 2 weeks.
Thank you.
All right. Great call. Thank you.
Bye.